Hi, I'm Pastor Kerry. Before we get started, there are a few things I want to encourage you to have on hand. First, I want to encourage you to have a set of the sermon notes. If you don't already have them, you can go to the link that's right down below the video. It'll take you to a place where you can print a set of the sermon notes for yourself. I also want to encourage you to have some communion elements. You want to have some bread or a cracker. You want to have some juice or some wine, and if you don't have juice or wine, probably any beverage would suffice. But you'll want to have those communion elements because here, in about 20 minutes, when we get to the end of the sermon, we'll move right into a time of communion with you. So, if you need any of those things, I would encourage you to pause the playback right now. Grab whatever you need once everything is ready, then go ahead and resume the video. So, my guess is that if you're like me, over the course of your life, you have probably had a few different jobs. And over the course of my life, I have been a pastor, I guess at this point, for more than half of my life. Is that true? Gosh, I should have done the math before I started talking out loud here. For about half my life, I think for more than half definitely for more than half my life, I've been a pastor. Wow. Time flies when you're having fun, doesn't it? But there were other jobs that I worked when I was younger. For example, when I was in my teens, I was a paper boy. I worked for a landscaping company, and I flipped burgers, and I waited tables among the many jobs that I held when I was a teenager. And I have to say that one of the things that I appreciate about being a pastor is that it is something that I do and my heart is in it 1,000%. No question about it. I absolutely put my heart into being a pastor. Now, that isn't to say that when I was a paperboy, or when I did landscaping, or when I was flipping burgers, that's not to say that I didn't do my best, because I honestly feel like I did, but I would also say that when I was flipping burgers, it's not like my heart was in it. It wasn't like this was something that I was incredibly passionate about. And if, there was some emergency that there was no way that you could drag me away from the burger making station. But all of that is simply to say that there are some jobs in which we fully engage. And then maybe there are some jobs where maybe we don't care quite as much for whatever reason. And I'm sure that some of you are thinking to yourselves right now, yeah, I know some people that have never cared about any job that they've ever had. And that may be true, but be that as it may, my hope is that all of us, at some point in our lives, maybe if that time hasn't arrived for you yet or for someone that you know yet, hopefully at some point they will find a job that they are passionate about, that they are fully engaged in, and their heart is truly in it. The reason that I bring that up today is because in our lectionary gospel reading for this coming Sunday, April 21st of 2024, Jesus is going to be talking about a particular profession where there were people that would help with this profession, and it sounds as if the people who would help those who were fully engaged in this profession, their helpers weren't necessarily engaging their hearts. Their hearts weren't really in it. So, without any further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at this Lenten gospel reading, this lectionary gospel reading, I should say. It's John chapter 10, verses 11 through 18. This is Jesus speaking now. And Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when the hired hand sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The hired hand runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock, one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. May God bless the reading of the powerful and compelling and fascinating word. So, my guess is that this is a passage with which you are at least passingly familiar. We have all heard Jesus talk about the fact that he is the Good Shepherd. And yet, my guess is that there are also things in this passage that maybe as I was reading through it right there and as you were reading along, you thought, what does that mean? Or, I didn't know that was in there. Well, it's in there. And so let's do what we always do. Let's talk through the passage. I think that there are some fascinating things that Jesus says in this passage, above and beyond the idea of Jesus being the Good Shepherd. And what we should probably start with is even the idea of what a shepherd was in Jesus' day. Now, I think that you are saying to yourself, well, I know what a shepherd was 2,000 years ago. A shepherd was someone who took care of the sheep, took care of the flock, and that is certainly true. And if you've heard me talk about this before, you won't be surprised when I tell you this. If you haven't heard me talk about this before, then you might be surprised to learn that 2,000 years ago, people who were shepherds were not generally looked upon as particularly esteemed members of society. In fact, quite the opposite. 2,000 years ago, for whatever reason, shepherds were looked down upon. And for most people, if you were going to be a shepherd, it meant that it was because you had exhausted all of your other employment opportunities. To be a shepherd was basically a job of last resort 2,000 years ago. And I know that's probably surprising to people who haven't heard me talk about that before. But that is probably one of the reasons why Jesus says at the very start, I am the good shepherd, because as far as most people were concerned 2,000 years ago, most shepherds weren't good people. They were bad people. Right or wrong, whether that is fair or not, that was the perception that Jesus, to some degree, was combating here and saying, no, I am the good shepherd. The other thing that I quickly want to point out to you is that this passage begins with Jesus saying the two words, I am. And that is very significant because, as far as you and I are concerned, we say the words I am all the time. I am Carrie O'Brien. I am a pastor. I am hungry. We use the two words I am to start a zillion different sentences. But what we have to also remind ourselves is that for the Hebrew people to whom Jesus was speaking 2 millennia ago, those two words I am also had a very special connotation. And I want to take you back to the Old Testament, and I want to remind you that when God called on Moses and said, Moses, you're going to lead the Hebrew people out of slavery in Egypt, Moses said, well, that's fine, God, I'll go tell them, but they're going to want to know who sent me. So who am I supposed to tell them sent me? Who are you? And what should I say your name is when I go and tell the Hebrew people all of this? And you remember God's response to Moses. God's response was, I am who I am. Tell them I am sent you. So those two words together, I am, were one of the names for the one true God. And so one of the things that we see Jesus often start sentences with is with the words I am as a connotation of his divinity, the fact that he was God in the flesh. So we've got a lot going on already. We've got Jesus saying I am, connoting the fact that he is claiming divinity, that he is God in the flesh. And then he says, I am the good shepherd, not a typical bad shepherd. I am the good shepherd. And then Jesus says something that you might be thinking to yourself, gosh, how did the disciples forget about that? But Jesus says the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Now, a normal shepherd 2,000 years ago wasn't probably in a dangerous situation going to sacrifice their lives for a literal flock of animals, but Jesus, of course, wasn't talking about a typical shepherd 2,000 years ago laying down his or her life for a typical flock of beasts of the earth. Jesus was talking about the fact that he was going to lay down his life for us as his sheep, for us as his flock. And again, Just 4 weeks ago, we were talking about the fact that the disciples somehow, they forgot about it. They forgot that Jesus had told them several times that he was going to lay down his life. And yet here it is in red letters in John chapter 10. Jesus goes on then, and he talks about something that most, if not all, shepherds had 2,000 years ago, which was a temporary substitute. Because think about it. A shepherd is pretty much a 24-hour-a-day job, 365 days a year. If you're a shepherd, then you have to stay with that flock at all times. That's your job. And most people, at some point over the course of 365 days, they have to go take care of this or take care of that. They have to take a break and be away from their job at some point. And so what even shepherds had 2,000 years ago is they had hired hands that would come and be their substitutes, would stand in for them when they had to go do this or that. And what Jesus says is that the hired hand isn't the shepherd and doesn't own the sheep. And so if a wolf comes along, the hired hand isn't going to stick around. The hired hand is going to head the other direction. The wolf is going to attack the flock and scatter it. Jesus says the man runs away because he's a hired hand. He doesn't care about the sheep. Interesting. And we'll come back and we'll talk more about that here in a few minutes. So that is the first paragraph, verses 11 through 13. Now, the second paragraph, verses 14 through 18. Jesus again reiterates, I am the good shepherd. I'm not a typical shepherd. I am a good shepherd. I am the good shepherd. Jesus says, I know my sheep know me. And so Jesus is talking about his disciples 2,000 years ago, talking about his modern day disciples as well. Jesus says, the disciples know me just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And he says it again. He says, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Then, in verse 16, Jesus said something that I would imagine was puzzling to the disciples 2,000 years ago. Now, you get it, I get it, but I'm sure that this would have been new and puzzling news to the disciples 2,000 years ago. Jesus says, I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice. There shall be one flock and one shepherd. Let's come back and let's talk about verse 16 a little more in depth here in just a minute or two. But now let's go ahead and finish out this second paragraph, verses 17 and 18. And in fact, before we talk about verses 17 and 18, what I want to do is I just want to tell you about a perception that I think a lot of Christians have. And honestly, I probably, when I am not thinking about it carefully, I probably have this as my default perception as well. So you and I know that 2,000 years ago, when Jesus arrived, that there was a mission that he was going to fulfill. We know that at the end of his life, that he was going to lay down his life for the sheep, just like this passage talks about. That this mission was going to take him to Jerusalem for the Passover. That he was going to go into the temple and he was going to overturn the money changers' tables. And he was going to get in trouble with the religious leaders and with the government officials. We know that he was going to be in the upper room with the disciples on the evening of the Passover meal. He was going to go to the Garden of Gethsemane. He was going to be arrested and betrayed. And that he was going to end up in a kangaroo court, and that he was ultimately going to be crucified. And then, most important of all, that just 3 days later, that there was going to be an empty tomb. Now, what I'm saying is, in all of this, I don't know about you, but I have a tendency to think of Jesus as being a passive participant in this entire mission. In other words, I tend to think of it as these things happened to Jesus. It was all part of the plan, it was always the mission, but these things happened to Jesus. Jesus was arrested. Jesus was put on trial. Jesus was crucified, and then Jesus was raised from the dead. Now, I want you to listen very carefully to what Jesus says here in verses 17 and 18, because it certainly seems like Jesus is saying that he was not a passive participant that these things just happened to Jesus. Listen to what Jesus says. He says, "The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father." And so what Jesus is saying here is that he's the one that orchestrated all of these events when they happened. That Jesus wasn't a passive participant at the end of this mission, that he was actively causing these things to happen. And I think that's a powerful reminder, at least for me. I don't know if that's particularly interesting to you, but I find it particularly interesting because it changes my perception of Jesus' role, particularly in the events that unfolded at the very end of his life and with his resurrection. So now, very quickly, what I want to do, because I am running short on time, is I want to talk about 3 of the lessons that we should take away from this fascinating passage. And the first lesson is this: as sheep, we need to beware of wolves and unreliable hired hands. As sheep, we need to beware of wolves and unreliable hired hands. So first, let's talk about the hired hands. I have a feeling, and the commentaries that I looked at this past week, most of them seem to agree, that the hired hands to which Jesus was referring were probably religious leaders 2,000 years ago, and by extension, religious leaders over the past 2,000 years. Now, it's important for us to remember that although I'm a pastor, and you probably not only know pastors, but you probably also know ministers, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. You probably also know priests. You might even know some rabbis. But what we, first of all, should acknowledge is that 2,000 years ago, there weren't pastors, there weren't priests, there weren't ministers, there were only rabbis 2,000 years ago, and the other Jewish religious leaders. But Jesus was implying that at least some of them didn't care about the flocks to which they had been assigned. Now, I'll say this: over the course of my 53 years, almost all of the pastors that I've known, all of the ministers that I've known, all of the priests that I've known, all of the rabbis that I've known, yes, I've known several rabbis, all of them have cared deeply about their flocks. And I certainly would like to think, and I certainly would contend, that I care deeply about my flock as well. But I have to admit that over the course of my 53 years, I've known a few hired hands that may have been in the position, may have had the title, but it sure didn't seem like they cared much about their flocks, which is a tragedy. And maybe you've known some like that. Hopefully you haven't, but I have. And boy, I pray that it's never said about me that I was a hired hand. I hope it will always be said about me that I was a shepherd that truly, truly loved and cared for my flock. So, first of all, we need to beware of hired hands, people, clergy, that religious leaders that don't care about their flocks. But we also need to watch out for wolves as well. And again, I'm short on time. I would love to talk to you more about what I perceive to be as wolves. Very quickly, I would just tell you that if you are on our church's email list, then you probably know that just over the past 3 or 4 years, that there have been several incidents where people have impersonated me and asked people from my church for money. And I consider those people to be wolves, and they are going to have to answer for being wolves someday. Someday they're going to have to answer for being wolves, whether it's in this life or it's in the next life. Anyone who chooses to be a wolf, they're going to have to answer for it. So, all right, that is the first lesson we should take from this passage. The second lesson is this: as sheep, we need to remember that there are other sheep in other pens. That's exactly what Jesus says at the start of verse 16. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen, therefore they are of other pens. And friends, I grew up in a church, And I don't know if it was ever explicitly said, but I know that I definitely had the impression that people in my denomination were the only Christians. Now, I'm 53 years old at this point, and I know that there are billions of Christians in the world today, that there have been billions and billions and billions of Christians over the last 2,000 years, and they have not all been a part of the denomination that I was born and raised in. Because just as Jesus says here, I have other sheep that are not of this pen. The disciples probably would have been baffled by that, because they probably would have looked around and said, well, if it's not us, then who else? Who else has Jesus been talking to? Well, I think that Jesus was speaking in the future tense here, knowing that there would be plenty of other sheep of plenty of other pens. And look, I could start naming off denominations, but I probably would leave one off, and so I don't want to start going down the list of denominations. But look, I hope that you believe, as I do, that if someone says that they are a Christian, then they probably are a Christian. I'm sure that there are a few exceptions, but if someone, look, just like we talked about a few weeks ago, Romans 10:9, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and you believe in your heart that Jesus raised him from the dead, then you are saved. I mean, that's what it takes to be a Christian at the end of the day. There are other sheep in other pens, but now, very quickly, oh my gosh, I'm so over time, but there is only one flock and only one shepherd, because at the end of the day, there is only one flock, regardless of whether we call ourselves disciples of Christ, or Methodists, or Presbyterians, or you Baptists. You fill in the denomination. Look, regardless of what denomination we call ourselves, we are all one flock. And most important of all, there is just one shepherd, and that shepherd is the Good Shepherd, is Jesus Christ. And friends, every week when we gather around the Lord's table, we honor the fact that Jesus, as he says several times in this passage, we honor the fact that the Good Shepherd laid down his life for us, laid down his life for us sheep. So right now, I want to encourage you to grab your communion elements, and I'll go ahead and I will grab mine. And I am going to invite you to partake with me at this time as I run out of time. The body of Christ, broken for us, we partake in remembrance of him. And the blood of Christ, shed for us, we drink in remembrance of him. Let us pray. God, we thank you that Jesus was and is indeed the Good Shepherd. We thank you that he laid down his life for us, for his sheep. God, help us to always remember that we are not the only sheep, that we are all part of one flock, and that someday we will have the opportunity to see our shepherd face to face. And we pray these things in his holy name. Amen. Well, thanks for joining us. We'll see you again next week.